If you went to Vito Genovese because a guy was doing you wrong, he would have this guy killed and then have you killed for telling on the guy. That was how Joe Valachi described his family's boss.
While there might not have ever really been a boss of bosses in Cosa Nostra because the commission filled that role, Vito Genovese was considered by law enforcement to be the top hoodlum in the 1950s.
He died in prison from a heart attack in 1969 while he was serving a 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking. And yet, while almost everyone can agree that he was a ruthless crime lord responsible for multiple murders by either his hand or his orders, the case that put him away for good has since been described as flimsy as best and a frame job at worst.
In this video, we will explore Vito Genovese's criminal record, the crimes he was accused of, and how the feds finally got him in 1959.
The raid on the Appalachian Mafia Conference was an embarrassment for both law enforcement and the Mafia. For years, almost every major law enforcement head in America denied the existence of a national crime syndicate, and then, on November 14, 1957, it could no longer be ignored. The Mafia was out of the shadows, and the FBI was caught with their guard down. The only thing left for the feds to do was to devote massive resources to investigate organized crime to try to catch up. On November 19th, a file was opened on Vito Genovese, where he was described as a well-known hoodlum from the New York, New Jersey area. Unlike some of the other men at Appalachian who had managed to stay in the shadows and off law enforcement's radars, Vito Genovese was well known. He came to the United States as a teenager around 1913, where he spoke broken but passable English. There are recordings of him speaking during the 1950s, and his English definitely improved as he rose through the underworld.
He later became a naturalized citizen, but that status was revoked in 1955 because he turned out he lied on his application about ever being arrested.
The case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was upheld. We don't know exactly when Vito made the transition from small-time hoodlum to official member of the Mafia, but most historians assume that it was in the early 1920s. He joined up with Joe Massaria's organization, which was the first of the 5 families to be founded in New York City during the 1890s. The original leader of that family was Peter Morello, and while he was in prison, Massaria, who was then a capo, ended up taking it over. When Morello was released from prison in the 1920s, he was officially demoted to consigliere.
But I do suspect after reading Joe Bonanno's autobiography, where he discusses a sit-down he attended with Maranzano, Massaria, and Morello, that Morello was probably really the actual boss, while Massaria was just a front.
Anyway, in a 15-year period that covers Genovese's first arrest when he was 19, all the way to the establishment of the Mafia Commission by Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese went from being a nobody to being the underboss of what was reorganized into the Luciano family. Here is a breakdown of his arrest record from this period. His first known run-in with the law happened in 1917, when he was arrested for illegal possession of a handgun and sentenced to 60 days in the workhouse. Aside from the gun being a revolver, the records for this case have been lost.
In fact, all of the specific details about the man's criminal history has been lost because the records were destroyed before the FBI took an interest in the man.
But we do have a list of charges and what the legal consequences were for a young Vito Genovese. In 1918, he was arrested for felonious assault and the charges were dismissed. In 1924, he was once again caught with an illegal handgun and those charges were dismissed. In May of 1924, his first homicide arrest occurred and an automobile was involved. Those charges were dismissed in June. He was busy in 1925. That January, he was charged with disorderly person. Then in July, it was burglary. And finally, in October, he was charged with using a gun to commit homicide. All the charges were dismissed. In 1927, the cops finally got him on petty larceny. The punishment was a fine of $50, and he spent 30 days in the city prison. All of the dismissed cases in the 1920s were done by judges.
It was not a grand jury declining to indict him, and it wasn't detectives withdrawing the charges because they realized they got the wrong guy.
With the records all gone, we can only speculate two possibilities for why this happened. The first is that Genovese's good friend and business associate, Lucky Luciano, made behind-the-scenes arrangements with the judges. The second is that it's possible that any witnesses against Genovese might have disappeared and thus been unable to testify against him in court. Or it could be a combination of those. Like what Luciano did for a young Albert Anastasia when the man was on death row. His lucky streak would break in the 1930s, which brings us to a rumored murder that Vito Genovese is associated with. He had been married with children when his wife died in either 1930 or 31.
I'm not sure of the cause, but nothing I read said it was suspicious or that he might have played a role.
FBI files say her death was only listed as natural causes. But shortly after that, a woman named Anna Petrillo caught his eye. The only problem was that she was married to Jerry Vernatico.
But that roadblock disappeared in 1932, after the man was found strangled to death on a rooftop.
Right after that, they got married. Interestingly, Vito Genovese, who had never been convicted of murder, but had been charged multiple times, was never arrested during the Castellamarese War.
If you believe in the expression of where there's smoke, there's fire, then Vito Genovese was definitely behind some of the murders in that conflict.
It's even highly suspected that he was the gunman that Joe Masseria assigned to ambush and kill Gaetano Reina with a shotgun. Reina was the head of his own organization, which is today's Lucchese family. He racked up a couple minor charges and dodged another homicide case in 1934, which was dismissed by the judge, but his hubris eventually caught up with him. The story goes like this. In 1934, a mob associate named Ferdinand Boccia was part of a scam that Genovese was running involving high-stakes poker games. There's a Sopranos episode from the second season called The Happy Wanderer that illustrates how this worked. The Mafia would use its connections to set up the game, and wealthy men who enjoyed gambling would be invited to play with an exclusive group of similar people. The game would take place in either a hotel or apartment, but it would be stacked in the mob's favor by having marked cards and a dealer that knew how to cheat. Plus, some of the other players would be mob plants. The idea was to bleed the well-to-do players dry and then have them come back for more at another time. There might even be a minor celebrity playing too, so that the guys losing money could still feel big about themselves since they were hanging out with VIPs. Ferdinand Boccia was part of this scam as he recruited players, and he also sometimes played. The mark would win in the first few hands, and with his confidence high, the bets would be raised and he would start to lose. With his ego inflated by the early wins, he would continue to play. One night they had a player who lost $160,000. This is about $3.7 million in 2026 value. Boccia then thought that he deserved a good cut of that money as a finder's fee since the mark was recruited into the game by him. For him, $35,000 seemed fair. We don't have an exact date for that game, but we know that Boccia kept hounding Genovese for the money and became very annoying to the vicious gangster. According to one source, Boccia already began his relationship with Vito Genovese on a bad note. Boccia and his friend William Gallo robbed a liquor store in Greenwich Village that was owned by Genovese's close associate Anthony Strollo, who was known on the streets by Tony Bender. 30 years later, in the 1960s, it's believed that Genovese ordered Tony Bender's murder as the man disappeared without a trace. But back then, robbing the liquor store of a made man, let alone a close friend of the vicious Don Vito, should have been a death sentence, according to the laws of the streets.
For some reason, the pair got a pass. Maybe they kicked up money to Genovese before the details came out about who actually owned the store they hit.
But as Boccia kept annoying Genovese for the money, Genovese figured that it was time for him to go. And he also decided that William Gallo was also to be killed thanks to his guilt by association with Boccia. Genovese gave the contract to the American-born Ernest the Hawk Rupolo. It's believed that he was most likely a made member of the Luciano family and was part of Genovese's faction. Both Gallo and Boccia were to be killed at the same time so that neither would learn of the other's demise and get spooked. Boccia was easy enough for Rupolo and his group to get. He was told to come to a cafe for what he thought would be a regular meeting. Instead, he was met by a couple of men who shot and killed him right there. Meanwhile, Rupolo and another man were with Gallo and they got him drunk. Rupolo broke away and made a phone call to confirm that Boccia was dead. After that, the group got in a car to take a drive to the movies.
Gallo was then shot 4 times and dumped on the road, as the 2 men assumed he was dead.
But Rupolo's eyesight was pretty poor, and it probably should have disqualified him from his profession as a hitman. Gallo was not dead, and ended up surviving. Even worse, he was telling the police about who did this to him. Genovese was understandably angry about how this was botched, and he ordered Rupolo to go on the lam. But Rupolo soon found himself in police custody, and he was sentenced to 9 years in prison for the attempted murder. Shortly after this, New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey began his own quest to take out the Mafia, and Lucky Luciano was his top priority.
The case against Luciano was also considered to be flimsy, with fabricated testimony to get the top hoodlum in New York City behind bars. But it worked.
Lucky Luciano was sent to a prison near the Canadian border, and Genovese stepped up to be the acting boss. But Genovese did not get to enjoy the power for long, despite enjoying it very much. He soon found himself on law enforcement's radar because of the Boccia murder. Normally this case would be a dead end, except Ernest Rupolo began talking. He flipped for 2 reasons. One was that he became disillusioned with the mob life since he was rotting behind bars, and the other was fear because law enforcement was aware of Murder Inc., and as a suspected mob hitman, he became a suspected member. His information gave authorities their first look at the Mafia, but for now, it was thought to be isolated in the New York area, and not a national criminal network with cooperative conspiracies between the families. Don Vito was feeling the pressure, and he decided that his best move would be to leave New York and go to Italy, where he could lay low and hope that this murder investigation would blow over. Italy was ruled by the fascist Benito Mussolini, and Genovese was able to live comfortably since he had lots of cash. Before World War II, his wife Anna would admit that she made multiple trips to visit her husband with suitcases of cash from his New York rackets that were being run in his absence. And despite being on another continent, it's believed that Genovese arranged the murder of an Italian newspaper publisher in New York because he was critical of Il Duce. Once the Allies invaded and liberated Italy, Genovese switched his alliances and helped the Americans as an interpreter and intelligence agent.
The arrangement fell apart after it was revealed that he was stealing supplies from the U.S. Army and selling them on the black market. He tried to bribe the officer that discovered his theft, but it didn't work, and he was arrested.
Then they found out he was wanted for murder in New York, and he was extradited back to the States. In the 10 years after the Boccia murder, there were only 3 men left who could connect Genovese to it. Ernie Rupolo, plus 2 other men who were involved on the hit, Peter Latempa and Jerry Esposito. Latempa apparently only agreed to testify against Genovese years earlier so he could get a reduced sentence because he did not actually think the man would ever return to America. Once he found out that he was going to be in court, he became afraid and demanded to be in police custody for his safety. He was put in a cell for his own protection. He was taking medicine for gallstones that the guards kept and gave him nightly, but one morning he was found dead in his cell. The medicine was actually poison, and there was enough of it in his system to kill multiple people. No one was charged for the murder. Around the same time, Jerry Esposito's bullet-ridden body was found dumped on a rural road. With only Rupolo available as a witness that no one else could collaborate, the jury acquitted Vito Genovese. A furious Judge Samuel Leibowitz had this to say: "I cannot speak for the jury, but I believe if there were even a shred of corroborating evidence, you would have been condemned to the electric chair. By devious means, among which were the terrorizing of witnesses, kidnapping them, Yes, even murdering those who would give evidence against you, you have thwarted justice time and again. On a side note, Ernest Rupolo was told not to worry about his betrayal, and he went on to live for 2 decades. In 1964, his body was discovered in Jamaica Bay, with his feet tied to concrete blocks. Some speculate that was Vito Genovese getting his revenge to remind the world that he never forgets a slight against him. But it's also possible that the mediocre contract killer was probably not a law-abiding citizen following his prison stint, with his murder being related to some unknown crime that has been forgotten. By this time, Frank Costello was the acting boss of the Luciano family, while Lucky was now living in Italy since the government deported him following the end of World War II. There was some tension between the two, as Vito believed that the throne belonged to him, while Costello believed that Vito had abdicated it. Costello also believed that since Vito was gone for a decade, he was out of touch with how things were now. Plus, the administration roles were full. Instead, Vito was made capo of the Greenwich Village crew, which he is believed to be the founder of during the 1920s, but he was not happy. In December of 1946, the Havana meeting took place, and Luciano was there. It was the first time in years that he presided over mob business, and one of the items on the agenda was heroin. In a little sidebar, it's rumored that Luciano took Genovese aside and reprimanded him for his behavior, reminding him that Lucky Luciano was still the family's official boss, and he better know his place. Don Vito bided his time to regain his strength in Cosa Nostra. While he did not rack up any new charges during the 1940s and 1950s, he was not living a squeaky clean lifestyle. Nor were there not any victims from the man's activities. Greenwich Village was under his control, and he liked to extort protection money from the local businesses. He also marketed himself as a labor consultant. What this meant was that because of Mafia control of various unions, he would extort payments from local businesses. In exchange for this money, he would direct the unions to allow those businesses to pay their workers less than union scale. The businesses saved money since their bribes were less than the wages, Vito made money, and the honest workers lost. If they complained, then they were threatened that they would lose their union cards as retaliation.
There was an equilibrium going on between the mob, the government, and local law enforcement.
While there were government hearings, the Mafia remained largely in the shadows, with anyone proclaiming its existence being accused of Italian discrimination.
That all shattered in 1957.
Vito Genovese was tired of being low on the ladder, and he ordered Vincent Gigante to murder Frank Costello. On the night of May 2nd, when Costello returned to his apartment building, he heard, "This is for you, Frank," and then a gunshot. He fell down and felt blood roll down his face. Seeing the blood and being nervous as Costello's doorman had seen him, Gigante fled, assuming that the hit was successful. But Costello was only grazed. He survived, and his doorman identified Gigante through a mugshot. Gigante went on the lam, and detectives were able to easily deduce that Genovese was behind the murder since Gigante was one of his guys. Costello got the hint, and feeling old, he agreed to step aside. Genovese was then elected to be the next boss by the family's capos. Albert Anastasia was assassinated on October 25th while he sat in a barber shop. There are 2 theories behind who killed him and why. The first is that Don Vito got the commission to go along with it, and the shooters were the Gallo brothers and Carmine Persico, who were part of the Profaci family. This was then done with Carlo Gambino being in on it, so he can position himself to be the new boss of that family.
Personally, I don't agree with this theory, because the witness descriptions of the shooters don't match those men.
And, according to Joe Bonanno's book, Anastasia was part of the conservative faction on the commission that also included Bonanno and Profaci.
The second theory, which I find more likely,
is that a group of capos from his own family killed him as they were worried that the increasingly agitated Anastasia, who had no problem ordering murders and committing them himself, was going to have them whacked. So, they decided to strike first. Most likely, Don Vito was aware of this impending assassination, and so was Lucchese boss Tommy Lucchese. They then paved the way for Gambino to become boss, and this new alliance held the majority. This now brings us to the Appalachian Conference. With new leadership at 2 of the 5 families, a national conference was called for, with all the Mafia families across the United States to attend. They made a blunder by having this in a small town in upstate New York that was far from New York City or Buffalo. The state troopers noticed a large influx of out-of-town cars that were all considered luxury vehicles, and they got curious. As they checked out who these people were, they discovered that many were well-known criminals, and a raid was made.
The mobsters panicked and ran. Some got away, but 62 were arrested.
And since they were all Italian, many were criminals, and they came from cities from all across America, it was obvious that the purpose of this meeting was the Mafia trying to coordinate crime on a national level. And given Vito Genovese's prominence in New York City, he was looked upon as the top hoodlum for law enforcement to get something on, especially when he had beaten them so many times before. It was an embarrassment. It got worse for law enforcement in 1958 when Vincent Gigante was put on trial for the attempted murder of Frank Costello. Undoubtedly, he had to have been offered a deal if he gave up Genovese, which he didn't. He claimed his innocence the whole time, and when Costello was put on the stand, the man upheld his oath of omerta and denied Gigante was the shooter. Gigante was acquitted and was made a free man. All resources were now spent trying to deconstruct Vito Genovese's life. The FBI even spoke to his wife Anna, who he had been estranged from. A few years earlier, though they were not divorced, they were separated, and she sued him in court for an increase in support money, claiming that he was a criminal kingpin who made more than he claimed. They discovered many companies he was part of, and how his family controlled what businesses could operate in what neighborhoods. But in the end, the FBI didn't find a smoking gun. But the Bureau of Narcotics was able to put together a case against him. Harry Anslinger headed that agency since 1930, and he was the first law enforcement head to realize that there was a national criminal network operating in the United States, as his men traced how and from where heroin was arriving in America. Vito Genovese and almost 24 others were charged and arrested for a conspiracy to import and distribute narcotics. Vincent Gigante found himself as a defendant as well. A lot of these people were involved in the drug game, and there was overwhelming evidence against them. But there seemed to be nothing directly linking Don Vito, and even the government admitted that, while he was the boss, he was distant from the drugs. There seemed to be nothing that could directly link him, until the prosecution brought in their star witness. Nelson Cantalopes was a low-level Puerto Rican drug dealer from East Harlem who testified how the drug network worked.
Plus, he also stated that he met Vito Genovese once in 1957, when the man came up to East Harlem and explained the whole operation to him.
He claimed that this was when Genovese was consolidating his power following Frank Costello's retirement, and that they were introduced by a mutual party. This testimony was crucial because it linked Genovese as a controller and financial backer of the international drug network, and it demonstrated that Genovese knew of the operation and participated in it through a supervisory way. Cantalopes was used by prosecutors to bridge the gap between the street guys and the bosses who did not get their hands dirty, thus demonstrating a conspiracy. The defense lawyers attacked Cantalopes' credibility, but the jury seemed to believe it enough to find Genovese and most of his co-defendants guilty. Genovese's bail was increased from the $50,000 he first paid before the trial to $150,000 as he awaited sentencing and then tried to appeal. But in 1960, the appeal was denied, and he was shipped off to Atlanta to serve 15 years. The declassified portion of his FBI file would double in length while he was away because he suspected Joe Valachi, a soldier of his family also doing time in Atlanta, of being a rat.
Valachi got word that he was going to be killed, and one day, in a panic, he murdered another inmate with a steel pipe, thinking that was the assassin.
He was wrong, and decided then that he was through with Cosa Nostra. Before, he was not a rat, but his ungrateful boss wanted him dead anyway. Now he was going to talk, and what he said shocked the nation about the true state of the Mafia. Many people have since questioned Nelson Cantalopes' testimony and the truth of it. In the book Five Families, author Selwyn Rabb quotes legendary New York City detective Ralph Salerno as saying, "To anyone who understands the protocol and insulation procedures of Cosa Nostra, this testimony is almost unbelievable." Some people have said that Cantalopes was paid off by Luciano to take down Genovese, while others believe he was pressured by zealous law enforcement agents working with prosecutors that were willing to bend the truth to send a man who was guilty of many other crimes to prison. After the trial, Nelson Cantalopes publicly claimed that his testimony was false and that he wanted to recant that.
He then later recanted that statement, saying that he only said it because the Mafia forced him to.
He would be killed in a knife fight at a bar in 1965.
I'm not sure of where I exactly stand, of if Cantalopes was a liar or not.
For most mob bosses, I would see this as a framing, but Vito Genovese is different. He was a gangster in every sense of the word, and I can see him as being the type of manager who would get his hands a little dirty during a leadership transition so that he could show his presence to the rank and file. It's similar to John Gotti, who made an effort to be seen on the streets so that everyone would know who he was.
One thing I do believe, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think that if this all happened 20 years later, the government would have had a strong RICO case against Genovese, and he would have went away for life instead of 15 years.
Which ended up being a life sentence for Vito Genovese anyway, since he died of a heart attack in 1969.